The dining room at my fiancé's parents' house was built to impress without ever asking permission to do so. The table was long and immaculate beneath a chandelier that cast a controlled golden glow not warm enough to comfort, not cold enough to offend. Every surface gleamed with intention. The walls carried expensive art that felt chosen more for status than love. Even the silence between sentences felt curated, stretched just enough to remind you that you were a guest, not an equal. I sat with my posture straight and my hands folded neatly in my lap, listening to the quiet rhythm of silverware against porcelain, aware that every movement I made was being absorbed into an unspoken evaluation. My fiancé rested a hand briefly on my knee under the table, a familiar gesture meant to reassure me, but it only reminded me how alone I was in that room. His mother looked at me with a smile that appeared kind at first glance. The kind people practice in mirrors, but her eyes lingered too long, weighing me. "You've never been to something like this before, have you?" she asked gently, as though she were asking about a movie or a restaurant, not drawing a line between worlds. I hesitated for half a second, long enough to realize the question was not curiosity, but confirmation. "No," I said, choosing honesty because pretending felt worse. "Not like that." Her smile widened in a way that felt relieved. She glanced at her husband, then back at me. "Well, she said that's exactly why we thought this might be good for you." My future father-in-law set his fork down and leaned back with practiced ease, the posture of a man accustomed to rooms pausing when he spoke. "We're hosting our annual charity gala next weekend," he said. "It's where people who matter tend to gather: donors, board members, community leaders." He let the phrase, "people who matter," settle into the air like a settled verdict. "It's a family tradition," he continued. "Same circles, same expectations, same standards." His wife nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving my face. "We thought it might be educational for you," she said softly, "to see how our world works." The words were wrapped in politeness, presented like a gift, but I felt their true shape immediately. This was not an invitation. This was a test, a public one. My fiancé shifted beside me. I saw him inhale as if he meant to say something, then exhale and reach for his water instead. That hesitation was familiar. He had grown up learning when silence was safer than resistance. "I'd love for you to come," his mother added. "You'll meet so many interesting people. It will be good exposure." Exposure, as if I were unfinished, as if the room itself might correct me simply by placing me inside it. I nodded slowly because declining would have been interpreted as weakness and questioning would have been labeled ungrateful. "Thank you," I said. "That sounds lovely." The word tasted wrong, but it passed. Conversation drifted back to topics that did not require my participation. Who was attending? Who had donated more last year? Which couple had quietly separated? Names were exchanged like currency, each one carrying weight and familiarity. Every so often someone glanced toward me, then looked away again, as if I were already receding into the background of their evening. I understood then what role I was meant to play. I was not being welcomed. I was being displayed, measured by proximity alone. When dessert arrived, my future mother-in-law leaned closer, lowering her voice as if offering advice rather than instruction. "You don't need to do anything special," she said. "Just be yourself. Simple is always best." The word simple landed heavier than any open insult. I smiled because that was what was required. Inside, something steadied instead of breaking. I had spent years learning how to sit in rooms where people underestimated me. I knew the difference between kindness and control. I knew when a smile was a blade. As we stood to leave, my fiancé slipped an arm around my shoulders. "It'll be fine," he whispered. "They mean well." I did not argue. Some lessons cannot be taught privately. On the drive home, the invitation replayed in my mind, not as words, but as intention. They believed they were bringing me into their world. They expected me to adjust, to shrink, to understand my place. They had no idea I was about to run the entire night. There was a reason my fiancé's parents never knew who I really was, and it had nothing to do with secrecy or deception. It was a choice layered and deliberate, built slowly over years of learning what happens when power enters places where it does not belong. In my professional life, I used my maiden name, the name I had built my career on, long before I ever met their son. It was the name on incorporation documents, contracts, and board minutes, the name donors recognized and respected. In my personal life, I was simply myself. No titles, no explanations. I learned early that when people meet your success before they meet you, they stop listening for your voice and start calculating your worth. I did not want my relationship to begin that way. My company was private intentionally, so the kind of organization that did not parade its leadership across social media or issue glossy press releases with smiling executives. Our work spoke quietly through outcomes, through sustained funding, through results that did not need applause. I was comfortable in that space, invisible to those who were not paying attention, unmistakable to those who mattered. When I met my fiancé, I told him what I did in broad strokes enough to be honest without turning myself into a resume. He knew I ran a foundation. He knew it was demanding. What he did not know, or perhaps chose not to fully absorb, was how large it was, how much responsibility rested on my decisions, how many lives were shaped by the numbers I signed off on each quarter. Part of that was my fault. I liked that he saw me without the filter of authority. I liked that he asked about my day instead of my net worth. I liked that when we talked about the future, it was framed around shared values, not leverage. He loved me genuinely. I never doubted that, but he had been raised in a family where image was currency and conflict was managed through silence. When his parents asked polite questions about my work, he answered for me vaguely safely. When they nodded and moved on, he did not push them to look closer. Later, when I asked him why he never corrected their assumptions, he would say, "Later, when things are calmer, after the wedding, after they get to know you." There was always a later that never arrived. His parents never asked because they did not feel the need to. In their world, people revealed themselves through the right schools, the right neighborhoods, the right dinner conversations. I did not speak their language, so they assumed I had nothing worth saying. They filled in the blanks with their own conclusions and found comfort there. I was sweet. I was simple. I was temporary. The irony was that their certainty was what kept them from the truth. They never searched my name because they never imagined it would be connected to anything beyond the room they were sitting in. They never asked follow-up questions because curiosity requires the belief that you might be wrong. They believed they already knew. That belief shaped everything. It shaped the way they spoke to me, the way they offered advice. I never asked for the way they framed opportunities as favors. It shaped the invitation to the gala, the careful language, the emphasis on standards and exposure. They assumed I would be impressed. They assumed I would be grateful. They assumed I would adjust myself to fit into the narrow space they had already assigned me. On the drive home from that dinner, my fiancé apologized in the quiet way he always did, not for what was said, but for how it made me feel. He told me they meant well. He told me they just wanted to help. I listened because I understood his position, but I also understood something else. Meaning well does not erase impact. Silence does not neutralize harm. His parents' lack of interest was not accidental. It was convenient. It allowed them to maintain control without confrontation, to shape narratives without challenge. And his avoidance, however unintentional, made him complicit in that comfort. I could have corrected them at any point. I could have said my name differently, explained my role more clearly, laid my credentials on the table, and watched the room shift. But I did not want that kind of recognition. I wanted respect that did not require proof. I wanted to be chosen without condition. That was the risk I took. It was a risk that now stood fully exposed. They never knew who I was because they never asked, and because I believed love should exist before power enters the conversation. I was about to learn what happens when that belief collides with a family that understands power as inheritance rather than responsibility. The official invitation arrived 3 days later in an envelope thick enough to suggest importance, the kind of paper chosen to feel permanent in your hands. I opened it at the kitchen counter while my fiancé stood nearby, pretending not to watch. The card was elegant cream-colored, embossed with the gala's name in raised lettering. My eyes moved instinctively to where names were listed. His parents' names were centered and bold. The foundation name followed beneath. And then, almost as an afterthought, my own name appeared near the bottom, smaller, lighter, stripped of any description. No title. No affiliation, just my name floating there as if it had wandered in by accident. I felt something tighten in my chest, not surprise but confirmation. They had been careful, careful enough to ensure I arrived unarmed. My phone buzzed before I could say anything. It was a message from his mother. Wear something simple, nothing flashy. This isn't about you. The words were polite, almost maternal, but they landed with precision. I stared at the screen, then at the invitation again, seeing it clearly now as a script rather than a gesture. This was not an event I was attending. It was a stage I was being placed on. That evening, while my fiancé showered, I received another message. This one accidentally sent, then quickly unsent, but not quickly enough. I caught a fragment of it in the notification preview, a sentence cut short but unmistakable. She'll behave once she realizes her place. My hands went cold. I did not need to imagine who it was meant for or who it was about. The unsent message told me more than anything they had said to my face. Over the next few days, details filled themselves in without effort. Seating charts were discussed openly during phone calls his parents made in the living room. Voices lowered just enough to feel discreet, but not enough to hide intention. I heard my name mentioned once, followed by a pause, then the phrase "near the volunteers." I learned later that my seat had been placed at a peripheral table far from the stage, far from the donors close enough to service doors that movement would distract from conversation. It was a strategic position, visible but not central, present but not important. My fiancé noticed my silence and mistook it for nerves. He tried to reassure me with small gestures, offering to leave early if I felt uncomfortable promising to stay close. I thanked him and said nothing else. Explaining would have required him to see what he was not yet ready to acknowledge. The night before the gala, his mother called to check in. Her tone was light, almost cheerful. She asked if I had found a dress, reminded me again that understated was best, that some people mistake extravagance for confidence. I agreed because arguing would have given her exactly what she wanted, a reaction she could later frame as sensitivity. After the call ended, I stood alone in my bedroom and considered the elegance of their plan. Every element had been designed to appear reasonable. The invitation, the advice, the seating, even the gossip. Nothing overt, nothing anyone could point to and name as cruelty. It was humiliation by context, by contrast, by implication. I understood then that they did not intend to embarrass me through confrontation. They intended to let the room do it for them. The gala would be filled with people who spoke their language fluently, who wore their history comfortably, who moved through wealth without effort. I would be placed just far enough outside that circle to feel the difference, to absorb the message without a single word being spoken. I was meant to feel small and grateful at the same time, grateful to be included, small enough not to forget it. That night, while my fiancé slept, I sat at my desk and reviewed a document I had already approved earlier that week, the final run of details for the gala. My name appeared at the top, clean and unmistakable, followed by my title and responsibilities. I traced it once with my finger, then closed the file without changing a thing. They had made their assumptions carefully. They had built their trap with patience, and they had done so because they believed I would accept it quietly. In the morning, I dressed simply exactly as instructed, not because I agreed with them, but because I wanted nothing about my appearance to distract from what was coming. As I stepped out of the house beside my fiancé, invitation tucked neatly into my bag, I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. The setup was complete. They believed they had written my role. They did not know they had handed me the script. The version of me they knew existed only in rooms where I chose to remain quiet, but there was another version of me that lived in places they had never imagined, stepping into places where decisions carried weight long after the conversation ended. The morning after the call with my future mother-in-law, I arrived at my office before sunrise, the city still dim and undecided outside the windows. The building was unmarked, intentionally understated, the kind of place you would walk past without realizing what happened inside. I liked it that way. My assistant was already there. Headset on, coffee, waiting at my desk, her expression focused and calm. She handed me a tablet without ceremony. Overnight updates, donor confirmations, final approvals. I scanned the numbers automatically, my mind shifting gears without effort. This was the world where I did not explain myself. This was the world where my decisions were expected. I was the CEO of a foundation that had grown quietly over the years, built not on spectacle, but on consistency. The kind of organization that attracted serious partners because we did not waste time convincing people we mattered. We funded hospitals, education initiatives, community programs that rarely made headlines but changed lives in measurable ways. I had learned early that influence did not need a spotlight to be effective. It needed structure, discipline, trust. That morning, the gala filled most of my schedule. The event my fiancé's parents were so eager to host was in practice being run by my team and funded largely through my organization's network. I reviewed the donor list line by line, recognizing names that carried real leverage, people who did not attend events to be seen, but to decide where resources would move next. I approved seating arrangements, noting which board members needed proximity to certain guests, which conversations needed to happen organically rather than forced. The run of show sat open on my screen. Each minute accounted for each transition designed to feel effortless. I adjusted the opening remarks, slightly refining the language to keep the focus on impact rather than ego. The master of ceremonies would introduce the foundation, acknowledge the host family, then welcome the chair of the evening, me. Though my name would not be highlighted until that moment by design, the timing mattered. I paused briefly at that line, not out of doubt, but awareness. I knew exactly what would happen when it was read aloud. I did not change it. My phone rang twice while I worked calls from board members, confirming attendance voices deferential efficient. They asked for my guidance. They waited for my approval. This was not power that needed to announce itself. It simply operated. Around midday, my head of operations stopped by my office with the final logistics report. Security was briefed, media protocols were set, volunteers had been assigned and trained, the venue had confirmed the layout. Everything was in place. I signed off without hesitation. Before she left, she asked if I wanted any special accommodations made for personal guests. I shook my head. No special treatment, I said. I want a normal night. She smiled, understanding exactly what I meant. Normal in my world meant professional. It meant the event would unfold according to plan, regardless of who felt comfortable or exposed. As the day progressed, I found myself thinking about the contrast between the room I was sitting in and the dining room where I had been spoken to like a student. In one space, my voice carried authority without question. In the other, it had been politely dismissed before I finished a sentence. The difference was not intelligence or effort. It was perception, and perception, I had learned, was the most fragile form of power there was. That afternoon, my fiancé texted to ask how my day was going. I told him it was busy. He replied with a heart emoji and a reminder to relax before the weekend. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. He loved me. I believed that. But love without courage had limits. As evening approached, I reviewed my calendar for the following week, approving budgets, confirming meetings, setting priorities that would ripple outward for months. This was the work I did when no one was watching, when no one needed to be impressed. It was the work that sustained everything else. Before leaving the office, I stood by the window and looked down at the street below, people moving through their lives unaware of how close they were to decisions that would affect them. I thought about the invitation waiting in my bag, the careful instructions, the seating chart designed to teach me a lesson. I felt no urge to correct anyone. I did not feel the need to defend myself. Confidence did not come from proving them wrong. It came from knowing exactly who I was when the room went quiet. As I turned off the lights and locked my office door behind me, I felt grounded steady in a way that had nothing to do with what was about to happen and everything to do with what already existed. They believed they were about to show me their world. They did not know I had built one of my own long before they ever learned my name. The night of the gala began without me exactly as they intended, and from what I later pieced together, it unfolded with the smooth confidence of people who believed they were in complete control. The venue filled steadily polished shoes crossing marble floors, voices rising in practiced warmth as familiar faces greeted one another. My fiancé's parents moved through the room like seasoned hosts, accepting compliments, offering introductions, basking in the quiet validation that came from being recognized by the right people. They spoke about the event as if it were an extension of themselves, a reflection of their values and standing, and no one challenged that assumption. When someone asked about me, his mother smiled and waved a hand dismissively, saying I would arrive shortly, that I was still getting ready, that I was a bit nervous. She said it fondly, as if nerves were expected from someone in my position. She's sweet, she added more than once. Very simple. The word landed softly among their circle, received with nods and polite murmurs of agreement. They laughed quietly as they imagined me walking into the room overdressed or underprepared, unsure of where to stand or who to speak to. My future father-in-law joked that it would be good for me to see how things were done at this level, how generosity and influence went hand in hand. His friends smiled, glasses raised, already certain of the hierarchy before the night had truly begun. Volunteers moved efficiently through the space, checking lists, adjusting place cards, unaware of the social choreography unfolding just beyond their reach. Board members arrived and were ushered toward the center tables, exchanging greetings with donors who carried themselves with the ease of people accustomed to being asked for favors. City leaders appeared flanked by aides, shaking hands, smiling for photos. The room hummed with expectation, the kind that builds when everyone believes they know what story they are about to witness. Somewhere in the middle of it all, my seat waited. It was positioned near the edge of the room, close to the service corridor, a place where movement was constant and attention fleeting. From there, I would have been visible without being included, present without being central. It was a clever placement, subtle enough to appear accidental. My fiancé noticed the seating arrangement when he arrived and hesitated, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. He said nothing. His parents were busy greeting guests, and he told himself there would be time later to adjust things if necessary. Later was a habit he relied on. As the minutes passed, his mother glanced toward the entrance more frequently, checking the time, confirming to those around her that I would be there soon. She just needs a moment, she said with a light laugh. Big nights can be overwhelming. Her friends smiled sympathetically, some with genuine kindness, others with curiosity sharpened by comparison. The anticipation was not cruel in their minds. It was instructional. The gala, after all, was meant to demonstrate standards. It was meant to show who belonged naturally and who needed guidance. Music began softly, glasses clinked, and conversations flowed toward predictable topics. Donations from previous years, future plans, who might be joining which board. My name surfaced occasionally, always framed as an accessory to my fiancé, never as a person with agency. He listened, uncomfortable, caught between loyalty and habit. He checked his phone, wondering why I had not texted, why I had not asked where to enter or who to look for. He did not know that I was already nearby, observing without being seen. Across the room, my future mother-in-law leaned in toward a group of women she had known for years, her voice lowering conspiratorially. She joked about how some people tried too hard at events like these, how borrowed elegance never quite fit. You can always tell, she said, smiling. Confidence isn't something you can put on. They laughed, comfortable in their shared understanding. At the edge of the space, staff finalized preparations for the opening remarks. The master of ceremonies reviewed the program, scanning the order, making mental notes. Everything was on schedule. Everything was ready. From where they stood, the night was unfolding exactly as planned. They believed they were waiting for me to arrive so the lesson could begin. They did not realize the lesson had already started, or that the room itself was about to shift in ways they could not control. I arrived early on purpose, not because I was anxious to be seen, but because I needed a moment to stand between who they believed I was and who I had always been when no one was watching. The service entrance opened quietly, and I stepped inside without ceremony, greeted by the low hum of coordination rather than applause. Staff moved with purpose, headsets murmuring schedules and confirmations, shoes soft against the floor. No one looked surprised to see me. No one asked who I was. They simply nodded, stepped aside, and kept moving. I paused near the operations table where clipboards were lined in neat rows, each labeled by department and timeline. My name appeared more than once, printed clearly at the top of the master sheet, followed by my title and a list of approvals already completed. I scanned it out of habit, not to check for errors, but to ground myself in what was real. This was not a role I was stepping into. It was a responsibility I had been carrying for months. I moved past the curtain that separated the backstage corridor from the ballroom and stopped just short of the opening, close enough to hear laughter and glassware, but far enough to remain unseen. From there, the room looked exactly as they had designed it, bright, elegant, and confident in its assumptions. I saw my future mother-in-law standing with her circle, her posture relaxed, her smile effortless. She was telling a story, punctuating it with small gestures, enjoying the attention. At one point, she lifted her glass and laughed, then leaned toward a woman beside her and said something I could not hear over the music. The woman glanced toward the entrance and smirked. I did not need to hear the words to understand them. A volunteer approached me with a question about timing, her voice respectful and calm. I answered without raising my voice, pointing out a minor adjustment in the schedule, and she thanked me before hurrying away. The exchange was brief and unremarkable, but it carried a quiet truth. In this space, my presence was expected. My authority was assumed. I adjusted my jacket simple and unadorned, exactly as I had been advised, and felt no urge to change a thing. Across the room, my fiancé checked his phone again, his brow creased with uncertainty. He scanned the crowd, then the seating chart, his eyes lingering on the table near the volunteers, where my place card sat untouched. He looked uncomfortable, caught between anticipation and something closer to dread. His mother noticed his distraction and followed his gaze. She laughed lightly and waved him off. "She's probably still in the car," she said. "She does that when she's nervous." The women around her smiled knowingly. One of them leaned closer and whispered something that made my future mother-in-law laugh louder than necessary. "She probably borrowed a dress," she said, her voice carrying just far enough to reach the edge of the room. "These things can be intimidating." The comment rippled through the group, softened by humor, sharpened by intent. I felt no sting, only clarity. They were performing certainty for one another, reinforcing the story they preferred because it made them comfortable. A member of the board approached my future father-in-law and asked a question about the evening's funding goals. He answered confidently, gesturing toward the room as if the success of the night rested in his hands. He spoke about legacy, about stewardship, about how proud he was to see the next generation involved. The irony passed unnoticed. Behind the scenes, final checks were being completed. The master of ceremonies stood with the program in hand, reviewing the opening remarks, lips moving silently as he rehearsed. I caught my name once then again, exactly where it was supposed to be. The timing was tight, the sequence precise. I took a breath and waited. Waiting has always been a skill of mine. Not passive waiting, but deliberate restraint, the kind that allows moments to unfold fully before intervening. As the lights dimmed slightly and the music softened, signaling the transition to the formal program, I felt the room lean forward in expectation. From their perspective, the next few minutes would confirm everything they believed. I would arrive late. I would find my seat quietly. I would absorb the lesson they had prepared for me. They did not know that the lesson had already turned, that the assumptions holding the room together were thinning under their own weight. I stood just out of sight, one step from the stage, calm and steady, listening to the final cues. The second shock was not the reveal itself, but the moment before it, when the truth was already present and no one yet recognized it. The lights softened just enough to signal attention without demanding it, and the murmur of conversation folded into a respectful quiet. The master of ceremonies stepped to the podium with an ease that suggested he had done this many times before, his smile practiced but sincere. He welcomed the guests, thanked the sponsors, acknowledged the host family with gracious words that drew approving nods from my fiancé's parents. They smiled back, comfortable, certain. I remained just beyond the curtain, close enough to hear every syllable, far enough to stay unseen. The program moved smoothly through its opening remarks exactly as planned, a brief overview of the Foundation's mission, a mention of the impact achieved over the past year, a promise of what the evening would help make possible. Applause rose and settled on cue. The room felt cohesive, aligned, confident in its shared understanding of who held the center. Then the master of ceremonies glanced down at the program again, clearing his throat in a way that carried a subtle shift. He looked up, scanning the room, and spoke with a clarity that cut through the remaining haze of expectation. "Before we begin," he said, "it is my honor to welcome the person who has been running tonight's event, our Chief Executive Officer and the chair for this evening." He paused just long enough to let the words land, then said my name. There was a moment that followed not silence exactly, but a collective intake of breath as if the room had misheard itself. I stepped out from behind the curtain and into the light. I did not rush. I did not hesitate. I walked with the same pace I used when entering boardrooms, steady and unremarkable, because authority does not need emphasis. As I crossed the short distance to the stage, faces turned toward me in stages. Recognition flickered first among the staff and volunteers, then among board members, then among donors who had seen my name attached to outcomes rather than introductions. My fiancé's parents were slower. I saw the shift reach them like a delayed echo. His mother's smile held for a fraction of a second too long before it faltered, confusion threading through the confidence she had worn all evening. His father straightened in his chair, eyes narrowing as if clarity might arrive if he focused hard enough. I took the microphone from the stand and thanked the master of ceremonies with a nod. The room quieted completely now, the kind of silence that follows recognition rather than shock. I spoke briefly because that was all that was needed. I thanked the guests for their support, acknowledged the host family with professionalism rather than warmth, and outlined the goals for the night with precision. I did not look toward my table. I did not scan for reactions. I focused on the work. As I spoke, I felt the balance of the room shift. People leaned in not because I demanded attention, but because they understood where it belonged. When I finished, the applause was measured and sincere, the kind that follows competence rather than spectacle. I handed the microphone back and stepped to the side of the stage, watching as conversations began to rearrange themselves around a new center. Board members approached first, offering brief words of appreciation, confirming timelines, asking quiet questions that assumed access. Donors followed, some familiar, some newly attentive, expressing interest in future initiatives, requesting meetings. Each interaction reinforced the same truth without needing to announce it. I was not a surprise guest. I was the axis around which the evening turned. From the corner of my eye, I saw my fiancé standing near his parents, his expression caught somewhere between pride and disbelief. He looked at me as if seeing me fully for the first time, not as a contradiction to what he believed, but as an expansion of it. His parents did not approach. His mother remained seated, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed forward as if movement might draw attention she was not ready to receive. His father rose once, then sat back down, the calculation behind his eyes rearranging itself rapidly. The circle around them had shifted. People who had laughed with them minutes earlier now glanced their way with curiosity sharpened by context. The social fabric they relied on had not torn. It had simply reoriented. As the program continued, I moved through the room with purpose, coordinating transitions, checking on volunteers, responding to quiet questions from the operations team. No one needed instructions shouted. A glance, a nod, a brief exchange was enough. Each small moment added weight to the larger one unfolding. I did not correct anyone. I did not explain. The reveal had already done its work. At one point, my fiancé's mother caught my eye across the room. Her expression held something new now, not anger, not embarrassment, but a cautious awareness that the ground beneath her assumptions had shifted. I met her gaze briefly, then looked away. The evening did not belong to reconciliation. It belonged to clarity. By the time the next segment began, the room had settled into its new alignment. The lesson they had planned to teach me had dissolved quietly, replaced by one they had not anticipated. Power. It turned out did not announce itself with volume. It arrived on time, followed the agenda, and let the truth speak for itself. Once the reveal settled into the room, the evening began to move differently, as if an unseen hand had turned a dial and adjusted the temperature of every interaction. Conversations that had once flowed around my fiancé's parents now angled toward me, not abruptly, not rudely, but with the quiet inevitability of gravity. Donors approached with relaxed confidence, their questions practical and forward-looking, asking about timelines, expansion, and sustainability rather than pleasantries. Board members waited for a moment when I was free, then leaned in with brief updates and confirmations, treating my attention as the scarce resource it was. Each exchange was efficient, respectful, and grounded in shared purpose. I could feel the center of the room reforming, not with noise, but with alignment. Across the ballroom, my future father-in-law attempted to re-enter conversations that had begun without him. He smiled, nodded, offered comments meant to signal relevance, but the rhythm had changed. People listened politely, then turned back to me with questions that required decisions he could not make. He watched this happen with a tightening expression, the realization arriving in stages. Hosting did not equal control. Legacy did not equal authority. At one point, a longtime family friend approached him, lowering her voice as she gestured subtly in my direction. Her expression was curious, not unkind, but it carried the unmistakable question he was not ready to answer. He responded with a vague smile and a shrug, a gesture that had once sufficed. It did not now. My future mother-in-law remained within her social circle, but the tone there shifted as well. Women she had guided through the evening earlier now glanced between her and me with interest sharpened by context. I could see calculations forming, connections being redrawn. Her laughter came less easily. When she spoke, she did so more carefully, as if aware that words could carry farther than intended. At one point, she caught herself mid-sentence, her gaze flicking toward me before she continued with a different emphasis. The room had learned to listen. My fiancé stood near the edge of the donor cluster, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of awe and unease. He was being introduced to people he had heard about but never met people who shook his hand warmly because of who he was standing beside. I saw him straighten unconsciously, absorbing a shift he had not known to anticipate. When our eyes met briefly, he smiled, tentative but sincere, as if he were proud and uncertain at the same time. I returned the smile without comment. There would be time later for explanations, or there would not. That decision was not yet mine to make. The most telling moment came when my future father-in-law approached me directly. He waited until I finished a conversation with a donor, then stepped forward with a practiced smile that no longer felt effortless. He congratulated me on the success of the opening, his tone formal, respectful, tinged with something close to caution. He spoke about the family's interest in exploring a partnership for a future initiative framed as an idea, then as a request. He waited. I listened, asked a clarifying question, and told him we would review the proposal after the event following our usual process. I did not promise anything. I did not soften the answer. I watched him absorb the boundary, watched the power dynamic settle into its new shape. He nodded, thanked me, and stepped back, a man recalibrating his understanding of where influence now rested. Nearby, my future mother-in-law observed the exchange, her posture stiffening as she realized the implications. This was not a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with charm. It was a reordering. Her circle noticed it too. Whispers began, subtle but persistent, moving through familiar networks. Church friends who had once deferred to her now asked questions she could not answer. Garden club acquaintances smiled with a curiosity that felt uncomfortably like reassessment. She responded with polite composure, but the ease was gone. Reputation, once unsettled, rarely returns to its original shape. Throughout it all, I continued to do what I had come to do. I checked on volunteers, ensured transitions ran smoothly, addressed small issues before they became visible. When a city leader approached to discuss a potential collaboration, I engaged, thoughtfully aware that the conversation would extend beyond the evening. When a donor expressed interest in increasing their commitment, I directed them to the appropriate follow-up, maintaining the integrity of our process. Each action reinforced the same message without repetition. This was not a performance, it was work. The more the room adjusted, the more the earlier assumptions dissolved. The seat near the volunteers where my place card still rested untouched became a quiet symbol noticed by those who had once thought it clever. Staff moved it discreetly, placing it among the central tables without announcement. No one commented. No one needed to. My fiancé's parents noticed, of course. His mother glanced at the new placement, then at me, then away, her lips pressing together as if holding back words she was no longer sure how to frame. As the evening progressed, I felt a strange calm settle in. Not triumph, not vindication, just steadiness. Watching power change hands did not thrill me. It clarified things. It showed me who adapted and who resisted, who understood responsibility and who clung to image. It showed me the cost of assumptions and the fragility of status built on proximity rather than substance. Near the end of the program, applause filled the room again, this time directed toward the impact achieved, the funds raised, the future promised. I stood at the edge of the stage, observing faces illuminated by satisfaction and relief. My fiancé joined me there close enough to speak quietly. He told me he was proud of me, his voice sincere, his eyes searching mine for reassurance. I thanked him and said nothing else. Pride was not the question. Choice was. As guests began to disperse, exchanging final words and planning next steps, I felt the evening settle into its conclusion. The lesson had been delivered without confrontation, without cruelty, without a single raised voice. The room had learned what it needed to learn by paying attention. Power had not been taken, it had been recognized. The collision came after the applause faded and the last donor drifted toward the exit, when the room no longer offered cover and the truth could not hide behind schedules or smiles. I was gathering my notes near the side corridor when I felt the shift behind me, the familiar tightening of air that precedes confrontation. My fiancé's parents approached together, their steps measured, their expressions carefully arranged. His mother spoke first, her voice low and controlled, as if volume alone might betray uncertainty. She said my name the way one does when reclaiming ownership of a conversation that has slipped away. She accused me of setting them up, of allowing them to walk into embarrassment, of withholding information that any reasonable person would have shared. She said it was cruel to let them believe one thing while planning another. She said family did not behave this way. I listened without interrupting because interruptions give people excuses. When she finished, I met her eyes and answered simply, "You invited me to be humiliated." I simply did not shrink. The words landed cleanly, without heat, without apology. Her face tightened, as if struck by a sudden chill. My future father-in-law stepped in quickly, attempting to soften the exchange, reframing the evening as a misunderstanding, a failure of communication. He spoke about intentions and appearances, about how things looked to others. I heard the familiar language of damage control, the same language used when image matters more than impact. I told him calmly that intentions do not erase outcomes and that appearances are not my responsibility to manage. The silence that followed was heavy, not dramatic, but final in its way. My fiancé stood between us, hands clenched at his sides, eyes moving from his parents to me and back again. I could see the conflict written across his face, the weight of years pressing against the immediacy of the moment. His mother turned to him, then her voice sharpening with urgency. She asked him if he knew. She asked him how long he had allowed this deception to continue. She asked him whose side he was on. The question was not rhetorical. It demanded an answer. He opened his mouth and closed it again, the habit of delay fighting for survival. I watched him carefully, not with anger, but with clarity. This was the moment that would define everything that followed, not the gala, not the reveal, but this choice. He took a breath and spoke, his voice steadier than I had expected. He said he loved me. He said he had known parts of my work, but had never asked for more because he did not want our relationship to be measured by status. He said he should have corrected their assumptions sooner. He said the evening had shown him how easily silence becomes agreement. His mother stared at him, stunned, her composure fracturing. She told him he was choosing conflict over family, that he was embarrassing them, that he was jeopardizing relationships they had spent decades building. He listened, then said quietly that respect was not something to be negotiated after the fact. The words did not raise his voice. They changed the room. His father looked at him with something like disappointment mixed with reluctant understanding, as if recognizing a line being crossed that could not be uncrossed. He said nothing. The absence of defense spoke louder than any argument. I stepped back then, not retreating, but allowing the space to belong to them. This was their reckoning as much as mine. I told them I did not expect apologies, and I did not require acceptance. I required boundaries. I said that if I were to remain part of this family, it would be as an equal, not an accessory or a lesson. I said I would not be diminished politely or otherwise. His mother reacted first, her voice rising despite herself, insisting that I had humiliated her in front of people who mattered, that reputation once damaged could not be repaired. I answered her gently, almost kindly, that reputation built on assumptions is fragile by nature. That answer ended the argument not because it convinced her, but because it exposed the truth she did not want to acknowledge. The corridor felt smaller then, as if the walls had drawn closer to witness what was being decided. My fiancé looked at me, searching for permission or reassurance. I gave him neither. This was his choice to make without guidance. He turned back to his parents and said he would not ask me to apologize for being who I was. He said he would not ask me to become smaller to make others comfortable. He said if that was unacceptable, then they would need to reconsider what family meant to them. The words were not dramatic. They were devastating. His mother fell silent, her expression hardening into something defensive and wounded. His father nodded once slowly as if acknowledging a loss he had not anticipated. They stepped away without another word, leaving behind a space that felt abruptly empty. My fiancé exhaled shakily and turned to me, eyes bright with something like fear and resolve. He asked me if we were all right. I told him the truth. That depended on what happened next. The collision had revealed everything that had been hidden beneath politeness and habit. There was no returning to before. As we walked out into the night air, the city cool and indifferent around us, I felt the weight of the evening settle fully. Not victory, not relief. Consequence. The consequences arrived quietly over the days that followed, not as a dramatic collapse, but as a steady rearranging of relationships that could not return to their previous shape. In the social circles my fiancé's parents had relied on for years, questions surfaced that could not be dismissed with charm. People who had once deferred now asked careful follow-ups. Invitations shifted. Conversations paused a beat longer than before. Reputation, I learned again, does not shatter in a single moment. It erodes when certainty gives way to doubt. His mother withdrew first, retreating behind polite distance, canceling lunches, declining calls she would once have welcomed. The women who had laughed with her at the gala now spoke of me with curiosity that bordered on respect, a shift she felt even when my name was not spoken aloud. His father became quieter, more measured, his confidence tempered by an awareness that influence requires more than familiarity. Neither of them apologized. I did not ask them to. An apology offered to restore comfort would have been meaningless. In the weeks that followed, my work continued without interruption. Meetings resumed, projects advanced. The gala's success translated into tangible outcomes, commitments fulfilled, resources directed where they were needed most. I returned to my routines with a sense of clarity I had not realized I was missing. I had not gained anything new that night. I had stopped carrying the weight of someone else's assumptions. My fiancé struggled at first, caught between relief and grief as he navigated the fallout of a family dynamic he had never questioned before. He listened more than he spoke. He asked harder questions of himself as much as of them. When he apologized to me, it was not for what his parents had done, but for the silence he had maintained. I accepted that apology because it came with action rather than reassurance. We set boundaries together calmly and firmly, not as punishment, but as protection. Some conversations ended abruptly. Others did not happen at all. The space that followed felt unfamiliar and necessary. When his parents eventually reached out again, it was cautiously without instruction or condescension. They spoke to me differently then, not warmly, but carefully, aware at last that politeness alone would not secure control. I met them where they were, neither inviting intimacy nor refusing civility. Respect, I had learned, does not require closeness. It requires recognition. Friends asked me later if the night had felt like revenge. I told them the truth. Revenge suggests intention to wound. I had none. I had simply refused to make myself smaller to preserve someone else's comfort. There is a difference. The most lasting consequence was internal. I stopped editing myself in anticipation of other people's limits. I stopped confusing patience with permission. I learned that dignity does not announce itself, and power does not need witnesses to be real. It exists whether it is acknowledged or not. One evening, weeks after the gala, I sat alone at my desk, the city quiet outside the window, and thought about the dinner where it had all begun. The careful smiles, the polite knife disguised as kindness. I felt no anger toward that moment. It had served its purpose. It had revealed the cost of staying quiet when clarity is required. I closed my laptop and stood feeling lighter than I had in years. I did not become powerful that night. I stopped pretending I was not.